All right, so we're almost done with our animation here, and we have like 2 stages left. So we just converted our tangent frames so that our keyframes would hit the ground solidly when it bounces off the ground. So you'll see that it kind of bounces, and it bounces at the different heights, which is good. It sort of comes to a slow roll in the end there. So let's see what else we can do. So one of the other animation principles that Disney set out in the early days was the squash and stretch. So we just did the arc-like motions, which is one of the principles. Also ease in, ease out. So we did ease in, ease out on the upper things without really doing anything, right? Because we had the tangent set to flat. And then for the other motion, when we hit the ground, we don't want ease in and out. So there's times to use ease in and out, and there's times not to use it. And so when when something hits another solid object, we want to make sure that we have that tangent to linear, so we're not easing in and out. But when we're at the top of an arc, like this, we are doing it. Now the other thing we can do is squash and stretch. So the other animation principle of Disney was squash and stretch. So we're going to want to do something a little tricky here. We want to basically stretch this, and the reason why I set keyframes earlier before is that we don't want interpolation between other frames without having a solid keyframe here. So you'll notice all my scale has been animated there. And we did it with the auto keyframe. So the auto keyframe will set the frame, but it'll only change things that have changed within that frame. And so let's go back to our first high point here. So the first thing I want to do is kind of stretch this. And I'm going to do these at varying degrees. So like if I want to stretch him, let's say I would stretch him twice as big as he was, right? So about 2. So you'll notice in scale and Y, I did like 1. Let's just say 2, for example. Okay, so the auto keyframe will interpolate that. Now, because I have solid keyframes here, you'll notice that it stretches, and then it goes back to its state. So from an animation standpoint there, it looks good, and I can go ahead and maybe do varying degrees of stretching there. So, maybe the first bounce it stretches twice as much. Second bounce, maybe like 1.5 times, right? So, if you want to numerically do that, you could say 1.5 if you want it precise. And it doesn't, your eyeballs are good as artists to really decide what these are. The numeric values are just kind of to make it easier. And so maybe the last one is like 1.25, so 1.25. Or again, you can kind of do it by eyeball, but sometimes when it gets to the smaller numbers, to comparatively look at them, you'll have to jump through the keyframes to see how much. So there's like 1, and let's say if I wanted to do it precisely here, I'll say 1.25. Okay. And I did 2, 3. It doesn't matter. I'll make it 5 anyway. 2, 3 would have been fine. But there it goes, bounced, and then back up. And then so we're going to want to do like maybe 1.1 here. Right. And then maybe for the last one. And you could play with this. You can make this however exaggerated you want. If you wanted to do maybe it doesn't stretch at all, the last one, right? So, now we've got this bouncing ball animation. So it stretches, but the problem is it only stretches up, and it doesn't squash. So we have stretch, but we don't have squash. So we want to go ahead and do stretch, okay? And now you'll notice, so again, I'm going to want to set these keyframes so that they're solid keyframes if I don't have, for the ones that are not keyed. So actually they're already keyed because I had keyed the other aspects here. I had set these previously, so they're already solid keys. Now what we'll want to do is add additional keys here. So let's say right after the point of impact, we want to leave this frame alone because when it impacts it's not squashed yet, but maybe 1 or 2 frames after. So let's just do 1 frame after. I'm going to go squash this, and it's left the ground a little bit. So I'm going to do like 75%, right? And I'm going to have to move him down to the ground a little bit more because of that jumping up that just automatically happens between the keyframes. And before it pops back up again, then I'm going to go back to 1. So, you know, in this case, it's easier just to type in the 1 back on the X or on the Y axis. And so now I have those 3 keyframes for the squash. And I'm going to want to do that consistently throughout this. So the squash again. So here's the regular frame. The squash is going to be the frame right after. So I'll go ahead and squash him. And he might not squash as much, you know, like for the next one. Maybe it's like 0.8 or something. And I move him down. And then the frame right after that, I'll go right back to the original state. And then for the next frame up, we go down again, hits the ground, frame right after. We're going to squash him a little bit less this time. So you can do it numerically or you can do it here in the window. So I'll give him, you know, a little bit less squash. And then move him down. And when you play these back, you can always go back and re-edit these keyframes. So you could just do the one in between the solid ones because, you know, we have him solidly here between these 2 frames. So there we have our squash, and then the last 2, maybe he doesn't squash very much. And you know, this is an artistic thing. You know, how much do you want to exaggerate that squash? I'm doing it numerically here, but you know, it really depends. Are you doing a very squishy ball, or you're doing a very like a bowling ball? But we do want to play with the exaggeration. So I would say don't do a bowling ball. And you know, play with that aspect of it. But here we go. So here's our squash and stretch animation. And let's look at it in the perspective view so we can get a better idea.